Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
They always said, you'll understand when you're a parent, like it was some grand, ancient truth that would click into place the second I heard a baby cry in the night or paid a mortgage I didn't want. Like pain and sacrifice were the damn passwords to some secret emotional enlightenment. But if that was the case, then I should have understood my father a long time ago, because I've lived with pain and silence for as long as I could remember, and all it ever made me feel was more alone, not wise. My name's Jack, and I grew up in a house where we didn't speak unless it was necessary. And even then, my dad made it feel like speaking was a concession, like words were an indulgence you had to earn by being useful, quiet, or invisible. We had rules, not conversations. We had structure, not comfort. We had dinner at 6:30 every night on the dot, and if you were late, you didn't eat. You learned quickly to chew with your mouth shut, to avoid eye contact during moments of weakness, and to smile only when someone else laughed first. And even then, you better be damn sure it wasn't sarcastic. He wasn't physically abusive. He didn't hit us. I always feel like I need to say that, like I have to preface the story with, he never raised a hand, so people don't look at me like I'm being dramatic. But you know what? Sometimes silence cuts deeper than fists. Sometimes the absence of love feels more like violence than hate ever could. My dad didn't beat me. He just made me feel like I didn't exist unless I did something wrong. That was his superpower. He erased you until you made a mistake, and then he made sure you never forgot it. My mom, she wasn't much better, but she wore it differently. She played the quiet martyr. She apologized for him when no one asked her to, and she comforted herself by whispering things like, he means well, or he had it worse growing up. She kept her hands busy, always folding laundry or baking something we didn't ask for, like motion could fill the gaps where her voice never dared go. I don't remember her ever standing up to him. Not once. I do remember her touching my back once when I was 12 and had locked myself in the bathroom crying after he called me a soft little ghost for not wanting to play football. She whispered through the door, "One day you'll understand." That's what they always said. That was the spell they cast over every damn disappointment. One day you'll understand. But I didn't want to understand. I wanted to feel something different. I wanted someone to look at me like I mattered just because I was there, not because I earned it, not because I'd proven anything, just because I was breathing and mine was a life worth loving. I wanted to scream at them that I wasn't a project, or a mirror, or some dull continuation of their unfinished business. I was a person, even if they refused to see it. The crazy part? I still stayed. I lived at home until I was 25. Part of it was money, sure, but the bigger part was fear. Because if I left, I'd have to face the world alone, and as twisted as it sounds, that quiet house of tension and muted disapproval was the only kind of normal I knew. And deep down, I think I believed, stupidly, that one day he might come around. That maybe, if I just became someone worthy enough, he'd finally look at me like I wasn't a waste of his time. But that moment never came. Not after I got promoted. Not when I bought my first car. Not even when I told him I'd paid off my student loans early. He just nodded and said, "That's what you're supposed to do," like praise was a currency he didn't believe in spending. And here's the part that screws with my head. The more I tried to not be like him, the more I caught myself imitating him in all the worst ways. I got cold with people when I felt vulnerable. I withdrew when things got emotional. I became efficient instead of affectionate. I ruined a few relationships with good women who just wanted me to talk to them, to let them in, and I couldn't. Or maybe I wouldn't. I didn't know how to be loved in real time, only remembered, like a ghost someone used to know. I told myself I'd never have kids. Not because I didn't want them, but because I was terrified I'd become my father. I was scared I'd look at my own child one day and see myself, see all the things I hated and couldn't fix, and start the whole damn cycle over again. But the thing is, you can only outrun your demons for so long. Sooner or later, they catch up, and they don't knock. They walk right in and sit at your dinner table like they never left. I spent years watching friends become dads. The beer belly crew with baby carriers and exhausted eyes, posting pictures of their kids' first soccer game like it was the Super Bowl. They always looked proud, tired, but proud. And every time I saw that, something in my chest tightened. I wanted that look. I wanted to feel that deep, unshakable pride in someone else. Not in myself, God no, but in someone I could lift up and love so hard they never had to question where they stood. I wanted to rewrite the rules. Start over. Burn the old playbook and build something new from the ashes. But that voice, his voice, it never stopped. You'll understand when you're a parent. Maybe I didn't want to understand him. Maybe I wanted to beat him at his own game. Or maybe, just maybe, I wanted to prove that love didn't have to come with conditions and caveats and silent stares. That it could just be. I didn't know it yet, but that thought, that rebellious, half-broken idea, would set everything in motion. Every choice, every lie, every single moment that would lead me to that day I walked into my father's house holding the hand of a little girl who had no idea the storm she was about to walk into. And the wildest part? She smiled at him like he might be the hero of her story. And for a second, just a second, I saw fear in his eyes. Not confusion. Fear. There's a certain kind of man who learns early how to disappear in plain sight, and I became that man before I was even old enough to drive. Not because I wanted to, but because it was the only way to survive in a house where attention meant conflict and silence meant safety. I figured out quickly that if I did everything right, if I followed the rules, got good grades, kept my voice down, and never asked for anything, then I could exist without causing waves, and at the time, that felt like winning. So I played the part, and I played it well. I kept my shoes by the door in a perfect row, folded my laundry sharp like paper, brought home straight A's with the same quiet shrug every semester, and never once asked to stay out late. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't want to give them a reason to speak. There was no "I love you," no "I'm proud of you," no warm look that told you who you were, only this cold, unspoken contract: behave, and we'll let you be. That kind of upbringing doesn't raise a child so much as it trains a performer, and by the time I was 20, I could pass for stable just by keeping my mouth shut and my calendar full. And that's exactly what I did. I got a job right after college working in tech support, nothing flashy, nothing ambitious, just stable and quiet and utterly forgettable. I clocked in on time, said yes, sir, to supervisors who didn't know my name, and spent my weekends alone in my apartment pretending I liked the silence. I dated a little, nothing serious. I think I scared people off without even realizing it, not by being cruel or distant in an obvious way, but because I had no idea how to let someone know me, no script to follow for intimacy, no language for vulnerability. People want more than politeness. They want you to show up. And I had spent so long hiding, I wasn't even sure what showing up would look like. Every Sunday, like clockwork, I'd visit my parents' house. I'd bring groceries if Mom hinted she needed eggs or bread, and I'd mow the lawn in summer and clear the gutters in fall, all while Dad sat on the porch with that blank stare like he was waiting for me to finish so he could go back to pretending I didn't exist. He never asked how I was. Never asked about my work, my friends, or if I was seeing anyone. And God forbid I ever volunteered that information, it would be met with some offhand grunt, as if talking about myself was somehow inappropriate, or worse, a sign of weakness. Still, I kept showing up. Week after week. Year after year. Because deep down, I still believed there was some kind of reward waiting for the good son. Some silent nod of approval that would land one day, if I just kept being dependable, if I never made a mess, if I never needed too much. But all I got was more of the same: cold coffee, awkward dinners, and that oppressive, suffocating feeling that no matter what I did, I'd never really be seen. And maybe that's when it started, that itch under my skin, the quiet anger, the sense that I was living a life that didn't belong to me but was built around other people's comfort. I wasn't living. I was maintaining. And I began to wonder what would happen if I stopped playing the role. If I made a choice so loud that they couldn't ignore me. If I stopped being the good son and became the honest one. Let me ask you something, and be real with me here. Have you ever done something huge just to see if your family would finally notice you? Tell me below, would they be shocked if you made a move like this? That question haunted me more than I'd like to admit. I'd lie in bed some nights and imagine scenarios where I broke the script, quit my job, moved across the country, married someone they'd never approve of, came home with a tattoo across my face, or dyed my hair blue. Hell, sometimes I fantasized about showing up at Thanksgiving with a boyfriend just to watch my dad's jaw twitch, just to make him react. But of course, I never did any of that. I just kept showing up, kept folding myself into shapes they'd tolerate, kept hoping for something that wasn't ever coming. And then Nora happened. And Nora, in all her chaotic beauty, was a fucking wrecking ball to my carefully maintained stillness. She was loud where I was quiet, messy where I was neat, and honest in a way that terrified me because she said the kind of things I'd spent my whole life choking down. She once told me during an argument, "You treat people like you're afraid of them leaving before they even do," and I remember standing there, stunned, because it was the first time someone had really seen me, without me having to explain or prove a damn thing. She made me feel something I hadn't felt since I was a kid, wanted. Not useful. Not impressive. Wanted. And it was the first time in my life I thought, maybe I could be a different kind of man. Maybe I could learn to be open, to be real, to be the kind of father I never had. We talked about kids. Adoption, specifically. She couldn't have children, and I didn't care. I didn't want to pass on blood, I wanted to pass on love. But just like that, she was gone. One morning she packed a bag and left a note that said, "I can't be with someone who refuses to feel out loud," and that was it. No goodbye. No conversation. Just absence. And in that vacuum, something inside me snapped, or maybe it finally woke up. I started thinking about that child we'd talked about, the one we never had. I started wondering if I could still be a father, not in the traditional sense, not in the planned and prepared way, but in the raw, defiant sense. Could I do something wild, something huge, not to spite her, not even to fulfill the dream we'd shared, but to finally claim something of my own? It wasn't about rebellion. It wasn't about redemption. It was about freedom. About stepping off the leash I'd worn my whole life and doing something that didn't make sense to anyone but me. And if it shocked my family? If it made my father stand up from his chair for the first time in years? Well then, maybe that would be worth it. Maybe that would be the moment I'd finally stopped being invisible. It wasn't love at first sight because I don't believe in that kind of thing anymore. Maybe I never really did, but something happened the first time I met Nora that shook the concrete under my feet. Like someone had just taken the life I'd carefully arranged and tipped it off the table with a flick of their wrist. It was the middle of March. I remember that much. Not because it was some magical spring day with birds singing and trees blooming, but because I was sitting alone in the corner of a half-dead coffee shop, waiting for my laptop to update, sipping a cup of something too bitter to enjoy, when she dropped her tote bag on my table like she belonged there. She didn't ask. She just looked at me, tilted her head slightly, and said, "You don't look like you're enjoying that coffee at all," and before I could even respond, she flagged down the barista and ordered me something else. That was Nora. No permission, no apologies, no time wasted. She didn't wait for life to give her a space, she took one. And that first conversation lasted 3 hours, bouncing from topic to topic like a pinball machine set on tilt. She was chaotic in a way that didn't feel dangerous, it felt alive. Her laugh was too loud for the room, and her eyes sparkled like they were always a few seconds ahead of you in the conversation. She talked about books she hadn't finished, cities she'd left in a rush, and people she loved fiercely until she didn't. She had this reckless honesty that both terrified and fascinated me. When I told her I worked in IT, she said, "God, that sounds boring," and smiled like she wasn't insulting me, just daring me to surprise her. And instead of taking offense, I laughed. Because she was right, my life was boring. Safe. Predictable. Bloodless. And somehow, in just a few hours, she cracked the surface. We started seeing each other after that. Slowly at first, like I was still trying to figure out if she was real or just some vivid daydream conjured up by a man starved for connection. But she kept showing up. Sometimes late. Sometimes barefoot. Sometimes with 2 bags of groceries and no idea what she wanted to cook. I found her impossible to pin down, but impossible to walk away from. She challenged me in ways I wasn't ready for and loved me in ways I didn't understand. She asked questions no one had ever dared ask about my family, my silence, the scars I wore on the inside that had never healed properly. One night, we were sitting on my living room floor, 2 bottles of wine in, listening to some moody indie band she loved, when she asked if I ever wanted kids. I said no out of habit because that was the answer I'd always given, the one I thought kept me safe from the fear of becoming my father. But she just looked at me and said, "That's not true. You'd be a better dad than he ever was. You just need someone to believe it first." And somehow, in that moment, I did. I believed it, because she did. We talked about adoption the way some people talk about escaping to another country, not as a last resort, but as a secret freedom. Nora couldn't have kids, and she didn't carry any shame about it, not like others might. She owned it. Said her body made other kinds of magic. But she lit up at the thought of taking in someone who needed a home, someone who'd been forgotten, like she had once. Because that's the part one haven't mentioned yet, Nora was a foster kid. In and out of homes until she was 17 and done with everyone. She didn't talk about it much, but when she did, it came out like a knife wrapped in silk, soft and brutal. She said love should never be a maybe. And I agreed, even though I didn't know what the hell love really meant yet. We started going to informational meetings together. Quiet ones, tucked into church basements and community centers with bad coffee and faded pamphlets. We filled out early forms, nothing binding, just intent. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was making a choice that was entirely mine, not about rebellion or guilt or proving something to a man who would never say my name with pride, just about building something from scratch with someone who made me feel real. But love doesn't always reward you for showing up. Sometimes it leaves the door open just long enough to let in the cold. It happened fast, like a skipped heartbeat. One morning, she didn't come by like she always did. Her text stopped mid-conversation the night before. Nothing strange, just as "see you tomorrow" that turned out to be a lie. I waited 2 days before calling hospitals. Waited a week before going by her old apartment. She was gone. No note. No call. Just gone. It took me a long time to stop blaming myself. I went over every conversation we had, every joke I didn't laugh at, every time I held back instead of saying what I really felt. But in the end, the only thing that was clear was this: she left because she had to. Because something in her still believed that staying would mean losing herself. And maybe she was right. But here's the thing. That dream we started, the child, the adoption, the idea that we could be better than where we came from, it didn't disappear with her. It stayed. It grew roots in the quiet spaces of my life. And even though I was alone again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger had already been set in motion. That I was already on the path, with or without her. And so, for the first time in my life, I made a decision that had nothing to do with being good or obedient or careful. I decided to keep going. To move forward with the adoption. Not because I wanted to prove something. Because I needed to become something. The thing no one tells you about finally doing something for yourself, not for approval, not for praise, not even for love, is that it feels less like a victory and more like a quiet, slow-burning kind of rebellion. The kind that doesn't announce itself with fireworks, but with silence, resolve, and 1,000 quiet decisions stacked on top of each other like bricks. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to go through with the adoption. It wasn't some cathartic movie moment where I looked in the mirror and saw the man I always wanted to be. It was more like a low, steady hum that started in my chest and wouldn't stop, this insistent, gnawing feeling that I had to do something before I disappeared completely. And maybe that's the honest truth of it. I was tired of being invisible, even to myself. Tired of playing the good son, the quiet employee, the dependable friend who never caused trouble and never asked for anything. I'd spent so long shrinking myself into a version of a man my father could tolerate that I didn't know what I wanted anymore, but I knew I needed to do something real, something impossible to undo. That was the only way I'd believe I was alive. That was the only way I'd prove I wasn't him. So I filled out the paperwork. Alone. On a Wednesday. No music, no fanfare, just a stack of forms on a dining table no one ever sat at, and me scribbling through questions about income, stability, parenting philosophy, medical history, and criminal background with a pen that kept skipping like it knew this wasn't how it was supposed to go. Every time the form asked about support network, I left it blank or lied. Every time it asked why I wanted to adopt, I gave them what they wanted to hear, to provide a stable, loving home for a child in need, when really, the truth was messier and darker and harder to name. It wasn't joy that drove me forward. It wasn't even love, not yet. It was this strange hunger, like my soul had been starving for something bigger than guilt and grief, something I couldn't buy or fake or run from. I didn't want a child because I was ready. I wanted one because I couldn't bear the thought of going another year, another month, maybe even another day without becoming someone different than the man I'd been raised to be. And the only way I knew how to do that was to create a family that looked nothing like the one I came from. The approval came sooner than I expected. A woman named Deidre from the agency called and told me my application had been reviewed, and based on my background check and interviews, they wanted to move forward. Her voice was warm but professional, like she'd said the same thing to hundreds of people before me. But to me, it felt like a gunshot in the quiet, sharp, sudden, irreversible. I remember nodding like she could see me through the phone, my fingers gripping the edge of the countertop so hard they went numb. I think I said thank you, but I honestly don't remember. All I know is I hung up the phone and stared at the wall for 10 minutes, wondering what the hell I'd just done. They gave me profiles. Dozens of them. Kids with names and faces and stories that punched you in the throat. Some had been in the system since birth, bouncing from house to house like luggage. Others had been removed recently, the trauma still fresh behind their smiles. I tried not to overthink it, tried not to play God, but it's impossible not to feel the weight of choosing a life that could end up in your hands. Some of them looked too much like me. Some reminded me of Nora in ways that hurt. And then there was her Lila. 7 years old. Auburn hair that looked like it had never been brushed without a fight. Eyes like fire and defiance and something else, like she'd seen too much and survived it all. She didn't smile in her photo. She smirked crooked, stubborn, wild. The file said she'd been in care since she was 4. Her mother had died OD in a bathroom stall. Father unknown. No siblings. Behavioral notes mentioned she didn't like loud noises or being touched unexpectedly. She refused to call any of her foster parents mom or dad. She was angry, distrustful, small for her age, a runner. But something about her pulled at me in a way I didn't understand. I wasn't looking for easy. I was looking for real. And Lila looked like the kind of real that didn't come wrapped in a bow. I didn't tell anyone. Not my coworkers, not my few remaining friends, not my parents, especially not my parents. I wanted the silence. I wanted it to be mine. Every move I made felt like stepping into a life that didn't belong to the man they thought I was. And I liked it that way. For the first time in my life, I wasn't asking for permission. I wasn't performing for anyone's approval. I was making a choice that didn't make sense to anyone but me. I remember the last email I got before the final placement confirmation. It was short. A couple of lines confirming the date I'd pick her up. They asked me to bring a small bag with clothes and a snack. Something familiar. Something safe. I read it 5 times. Then I stared at my empty guest room and realized I had no idea what safe looked like, but I'd die trying to figure it out for her. And beneath all the nerves and doubts and fear, there was something else I hadn't felt in a long time, a flicker of anticipation. Not happiness, not yet. but the beginning of something new. Something bigger than guilt, bigger than grief, bigger than the ghost of the man who raised me. I was about to become a father, and no one knew. The drive was long enough to doubt every decision I'd ever made, the kind of distance that doesn't just stretch your legs but your thoughts, pulling them out into places you usually avoid when your life is quiet and routine and controlled. I didn't listen to music. I couldn't. Every song on the radio felt like it belonged to someone with less on the line, someone still deciding whether to take the leap, not someone who already jumped and was now hurtling towards something he couldn't see clearly yet. I drove through 2 states in silence, hands tight on the wheel, my stomach tying knots I didn't even know had names. I remember the agency building looking more like a dentist's office than the place where a life could change. Beige walls, flickering overhead lights, the kind of chairs that make your back ache on purpose. There were hand-drawn pictures on the walls from kids who had passed through, most of them smiling in a way that didn't quite reach their eyes. The woman at the desk, I think her name was Carla, gave me a thin smile when I told her who I was. She nodded like she'd done this 100 times, and maybe she had, but this wasn't a routine to me. This was the earthquake. They didn't bring Lila out right away. First there were more forms, more signatures, more legal phrases, and last-minute warnings wrapped in soft voices. She's been through a lot, they said. She doesn't trust easily. Give her space. Don't expect instant bonding. It felt less like a pep talk and more like they were trying to protect me from her, or maybe her from me. And honestly, maybe they were right to worry. I wasn't the guy you pictured when you thought single father, wasn't particularly warm, didn't know how to braid hair or deal with tantrums or answer questions about fairies and monsters. But I was there. I'd showed up. And I was ready to learn. When she finally walked into the room, she didn't look at me right away. She came in slow, dragging a small rolling suitcase with one hand and clutching a tattered stuffed tiger with the other. Her hair was wild, the kind of wild that said no one had tried to brush it in days without a fight, and her shoes didn't match. One was pink. One was black. She stopped a few feet away and stared up at me with this hard, calculating look like she was sizing up whether I was worth the trouble. I didn't smile. I didn't crouch down or try to win her over with a joke. I just said, "Hi, Lila." She looked at me for a long moment, then tilted her head and said, "You look scared." And just like that, she stripped me down to the truth with 5 words. I laughed not because it was funny, but because she was right, and no one had ever said it so plainly before. "Yeah," I said. "I am." She nodded like that was an acceptable answer, and then walked past me toward the door. No hug, no handshake, no tears. Just the unspoken understanding that we were both walking into the unknown together. The drive back was brutal in a way I hadn't expected. Not because she cried or screamed or refused to come with me, she didn't. It was the silence. Heavy and sharp and full of things neither of us knew how to say yet. She sat in the back seat, even though I offered the front. She stared out the window like she'd been watching the world from a distance her whole life. Every once in a while, I'd glance at her in the rearview mirror and catch her looking at me, quick and cautious, like she was waiting for me to mess up. And maybe I was waiting too. I didn't speak much, just pointed out a few things as we passed them: a field of sunflowers, a billboard with a giant cat wearing sunglasses, a gas station shaped like a castle. She didn't laugh or ask questions, but I saw her eyes flick toward the things I mentioned, and that felt like a win. That felt like something. We stopped once for food, and when I asked what she wanted, she shrugged and said, "I don't care." I bought her chicken nuggets and apple slices, and when I handed them to her, she muttered a soft, barely audible, "Thanks." It hit me harder than I expected, like she'd handed me a key I didn't know I needed. By the time we pulled into my driveway, the sky had darkened and the air had cooled, and everything felt slower, heavier, like the moment right before a storm. I opened the door for her, showed her the guest room, her room now, and she walked in without a word. She looked around, touched the edge of the bedspread, peeked inside the closet. "It smells like new stuff," she said, then sat down and stared at the wall. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. I stood there like an idiot, hands in my pockets, until she said, "You can go now." So I did. I went back to my own room and sat on the edge of my bed for what felt like hours, listening for any sound from hers, footsteps, crying, something. But there was nothing. Just that same heavy silence that followed us all the way home. And yet, somehow, it didn't feel like failure. It felt like the beginning of something we couldn't name yet. She was in my house. She had a bed, a toothbrush, a nightlight, a space that belonged to her and no one else. And even if she didn't trust it yet, even if she didn't trust me, she was here. I thought about my father and how he never would have made this drive, how he would have told me this was reckless, selfish, stupid. That you don't bring a stranger into your home just to prove a point. That parenting isn't a game or a redemption story. That it's hard, thankless, and brutal. And, for once, I agreed with him. But I also knew this, even in that quiet, even in her silence, I had already done more than he ever did. I had shown up. And that, at least, was a place to start. I had forgotten about the barbecue, which sounds impossible now, looking back, but it's true, in the whirlwind of paperwork, nerves, sleepless nights, and the surreal reality of suddenly being responsible for a small, broken-hearted human. I completely blanked on the fact that my parents were hosting one of their traditional spring family get-togethers the same weekend I brought Lila home. It had been on the calendar for weeks, maybe months, one of those routine obligations that hovered on the edge of my consciousness like dental appointments and oil changes, something you know you should prepare for, but never really do. I hadn't planned to attend, of course, not with everything that was unfolding in my life, but plans have a funny way of turning on you when your past lives too close to your present. We had barely walked through the door when the knock came, sharp, impatient, familiar, the kind of knock that says you're late, even when no one invited you. Lila had been trailing behind me, cautiously exploring each room with the wariness of a kid who'd learned never to trust anything that looked permanent. She was holding her stuffed tiger under one arm and a juice box in the other, and the sound of that knock made her freeze in place like a deer caught in headlights. I looked through the peephole and nearly laughed, not because it was funny, but because of course it was him. My father, standing there in his pressed shirt, grill spatula in hand like he was some goddamn suburban cowboy. Behind him, I could see the familiar faces of my cousins, a few neighbors, a canopy tent I hadn't seen in years, and a half-inflated bounce house being ignored by children who clearly weren't in the mood. My mother stood a few feet back, holding a casserole dish like a shield, pretending she wasn't watching me through narrowed eyes. I didn't want to open the door. Every instinct in my body told me to ignore it, to pretend we weren't home, to hide in the laundry room with Lila until they all gave up and left. But the damage was already done. My father knocked again, harder this time, and shouted, "Jack, you coming or what? You were supposed to bring ice." And that's when Lila, standing behind me with her head tilted to the side, asked the question that would split my life in two, "Is that my grandpa?" I turned slowly, not sure what expression was on my face, only knowing that something in me cracked open at the sound of that word, not because it was sweet, but because it was too soon. Too real. Too dangerous. I knelt down, eye level with her, and said, "That's someone I used to know." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either, and in her eyes I saw the kind of understanding that doesn't belong to 7-year-olds, the understanding that some things are better left unnamed. But the knock came again, followed by my father's voice, this time laced with suspicion. "Jack, open the damn door. We know you're home." There was no escaping it now. I stood, took a deep breath, and opened the door. I will never forget the look on his face. He didn't see Lila at first, just me, tired, unshaven, wearing a wrinkled t-shirt and holding a juice box I didn't realize I still had in my hand. He opened his mouth, probably to make some crack about me sleeping in or forgetting the ice, but then his eyes shifted down, and there she was, standing behind my leg, half hidden, but watching him with that same wild, assessing look she'd given me the first time we met. And my father, the man who hadn't stood for anything in 30 years, who'd sat through weddings, funerals, and half of his own life like a statue, took a slow, trembling step back, then another forward. And then he did something I never imagined he was capable of. He stood up straighter. Not because he wanted to welcome her. Because he didn't know what the hell was happening. There was a beat of pure electric silence. The kind of silence that isn't quiet, exactly, but filled with all the unsaid things screaming beneath the surface. My mother stepped forward, her eyes widening like she'd just discovered a hidden chapter in a book she thought she'd already read. One of my cousins dropped a drink. Somewhere behind them, someone turned off the music. I felt like the main character in a scene I hadn't rehearsed, a performance I never agreed to give. "What the hell is this?" my father asked, not even trying to lower his voice, not even attempting the usual civility he wrapped around his disapproval. "Who? What is going on here?" And Lila, bless her unfiltered little heart, stepped forward, chin tilted upward like a general preparing for war, and said, "I live here now." The words echoed. I couldn't breathe. My mother gasped. My father turned to me with a look that was equal parts betrayal and disgust, like I'd defiled something sacred by breaking the rules of how life is supposed to go. "You adopted a kid?" he asked, almost spitting the words. "Without telling us? Without asking? Are you out of your mind?" I didn't yell. I didn't defend myself. I just said, "Yeah, I did." And in that moment, I swear to God, I became someone else. Someone I didn't recognize yet, but someone stronger, heavier, more real. Lila looked up at me, and for the first time, she slipped her hand into mine. It was small, calloused, and unsure, but it was there. My mother began to cry. Quietly, like she always did, like a faucet no one could shut off. My father just stood there, jaw tight, eyes burning with something between rage and confusion. Then, with all the grace of a man who'd never learned how to lose, he turned and walked away. Back to his grill. Back to his lawn chair. Back to the version of the world where nothing ever changes unless he says so. The door was still open. But I closed it. Not because I was ashamed, but because I wasn't going to let that world inside. Not anymore. It didn't take long after I closed the door for the knock to come again. Not the loud, impatient knock of a man demanding answers, but the quieter, more controlled kind that says I'm about to have a conversation whether I want to or not. Lila was still holding my hand when it happened, and I felt her fingers tighten just slightly, not in fear exactly, but in anticipation, like she already understood that whatever came next was going to echo for a long time. I looked down at her and said, "Go to your room for a minute," but she didn't move, just blinked at me with those steady, tired eyes and said, "No, I didn't argue." I couldn't. Because if I was about to confront the man who made me afraid of my own voice for 30 years, maybe it was fitting that someone was there to see it finally break free. When I opened the door again, he didn't ask to come in. He just stepped across the threshold like he owned the place, like the walls still bent toward his authority, like I hadn't just made a decision without his permission for the first damn time in my life. My mother was behind him, not crying anymore, but looking at me like she couldn't figure out where her son had gone, like she was staring at a stranger wearing my face. I let them in without a word and motioned for Lila to go upstairs, and this time, she listened. But not all the way. I heard her sit on the top step and stay very, very still. And I didn't stop her. My dad didn't waste time. He walked into my kitchen, leaned against the counter like he used to when lecturing me after school, and said, "What the hell were you thinking?" I didn't answer. Not right away. Because it wasn't a question, it was a verdict. And I'd heard it before. 1,000 times. Different words, same tone. Always that low, simmering disappointment. Always that insinuation that whatever I had done, it was selfish, stupid, unnecessary, or all three. I was thinking, I finally said, slowly, clearly, that I wasn't going to wait for your approval for the rest of my life. That stopped him for a second. just long enough for my mother to gasp again and cover her mouth like I'd slapped someone. I turned to her and added, I love her. I didn't plan it to hurt you. I did it because I wanted something that was mine. And because she needed someone to fight for her, and no one ever did that for me. The silence that followed felt like stepping off a cliff. He crossed his arms and shook his head like I was an idiot, like I was throwing my life away for a cause I didn't understand. You don't know what being a parent means, he said, and I swear to God, it was like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. I exploded. Years of swallowed anger came up all at once, no filter, no breaks, no carefully chosen words. You don't get to say that, I shouted, louder than I'd ever dared raise my voice in front of him. You don't get to talk about parenting like you were ever really there. You sat in that goddamn chair for 30 years and never once asked me how I felt about anything. You never said you were proud. You never told me I mattered. You controlled everything by not saying a word, and you called that discipline. You called that fatherhood. Well, guess what? I'm not you. I'm not gonna raise a kid afraid of my voice, waiting for silence to turn into punishment. I'm not going to let her think love is something you have to earn by being invisible. My mother cried harder now, covering her face, and my father just stared at me, face flushed, breathing like he'd just taken a punch to the gut. For the first time in my life, I saw him not as the towering man who defined my childhood, but as a person, small and cornered and absolutely unprepared for someone to challenge his version of reality. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't what I expected. You think I wanted to be like that, he said, and his voice cracked in a way I'd never heard. You think I didn't know? I hated it, Jack. Every goddamn day I hated it. But I didn't know another way. My father, he was worse. He broke us like horses. You learn to shut up, or get put through a wall. So I shut up. I thought if I didn't hit you, I was doing better. I thought if I paid the bills, kept food on the table, showed up, that was enough. It was more than I ever got. He looked at me, eyes wide now, like he was waiting to be forgiven, but also terrified of what it would mean if I didn't. I didn't know how to love you, he said. I thought I had more time to learn. And just like that, the air left the room. I didn't know what to say. I stood there, completely disarmed, because for the first time in my entire life, he wasn't trying to win. He wasn't trying to be right. He was just being real. And part of me hated him more for that. Because where the hell was that honesty when I needed it? Where was that vulnerability when I was 8, 10, 16 and breaking inside, but too proud to show it? I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say anything, Lila's voice floated down the stairs, soft and uncertain. Does that mean I'm not in trouble? The three of us turned at once, and there she was, sitting cross-legged on the top step, Tiger in her lap, eyes darting between us like she'd just witnessed the aftermath of a war she didn't understand. My father looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment I saw something flicker behind his eyes, not approval, not affection, but maybe the tiniest scrap of recognition. Like he'd been punched with the reality that this wasn't about theory or legacy or shame anymore. It was about her. About what came next. No one answered her question, and honestly, there was no answer that would have made sense anyway. Because the truth is, none of us knew what the hell came next. Not yet. It's a strange thing, the way quiet moments can feel louder than arguments, how the stillness between words can stretch so long it starts to hum in your ears like a warning. That's what it felt like in the weeks that followed the confrontation with my father, like everything was hushed, waiting, balancing on a wire. I had said everything I'd ever wanted to say, broken the chains I'd worn for decades, cracked open a wall I once believed was impenetrable, and yet, instead of feeling relief or victory, I just felt unfinished. Like there was still something lingering, some truth hiding under the floorboards that hadn't yet seen daylight. And Lila, she wasn't a kid who let things stay buried for long. She started asking about her real dad 2 weeks after she moved in fully, which wasn't unexpected, but still hit me like a sucker punch to the chest. We were sitting at the kitchen table, her with a pencil in her hand, tongue peeking out the side of her mouth while she did math homework, and me pretending to look busy with bills I didn't want to pay when she asked, without even lifting her head, was my real dad a bad guy? I didn't respond at first because the truth was, I didn't know. Her file had only listed father unknown, and the caseworker had shrugged when I'd asked if there was any additional information. But the deeper truth, the one I was just beginning to wrestle with, was that I wasn't sure if I had been the good guy in this story either. So I gave her the only honest answer I had. I don't think he was ready to be a dad, I said carefully, watching her reaction from the corner of my eye. She didn't look up, didn't blink, just nodded slowly like she was filing it away in a cabinet already overstuffed with questions no one had ever answered. A few seconds later she said, "You didn't know me, and you wanted me anyway." And God help me, I didn't know what to do with that sentence. It was so simple, so vulnerable, so quietly devastating, and all I could think was, did I? Did I really want her? Or had I needed her? Because those are two very different things. At night, I started dreaming again, which I hadn't done in years. Dreams where I was back in my father's house, but everything was flipped rooms that shouldn't exist, walls closing in, my mother speaking in riddles, and Lila always somewhere in the background, asking me to find her, but every time I got close, she disappeared behind a door I couldn't open. I'd wake up sweating, heart racing, unsure if I was running from something or toward it. That's when the guilt started creeping in, the kind of guilt that doesn't shout but whispers, what if you didn't save her? What if you just dragged her into your mess to prove you're nothing like the man who made you? But then she'd do something completely ordinary, like ask for cereal in the morning or curl up on the couch beside me without saying a word, and it would hit me all over again, how much space she had already carved into my life without even trying. She was chaos in motion, but in all the right ways. She refused to be shaped by anyone's expectations, including mine. Some nights, we'd watch old movies together, and she'd talk right through the quiet scenes, asking questions about plot holes or making up her own endings. She hated sad endings. She told me once, very seriously, that all stories should end with someone getting a dog and a second chance. I didn't know how to tell her that real life rarely worked like that, and that second chances sometimes came dressed in guilt, wrapped in silence, and soaked in the kind of fear you never fully shake. One afternoon, I found her sitting alone in her room, staring at the photo of her mom that she kept tucked in her nightstand. It was the only picture she had, wrinkled and faded, but she looked at it like it still had breath in it. When I asked what she was thinking, she said, "I wonder if she would have liked you." And that question broke something in me, not because it was sweet, but because it was so fucking heavy. I told her I hoped so, but inside, I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure if anyone would like the man I had been before this, the man who adopted her out of a need that wasn't pure, who'd kept her secret like a weapon, who wanted so badly to be the opposite of his father that he didn't stop to ask if he was ready to be anything at all. And then came the letter. It was buried in an envelope I'd never opened, one from her case file, shoved into a folder I'd put off reading, too overwhelmed, too scared, too stupid. It was a letter from Lila's birth mother, written weeks before she died. It wasn't long, just a few lines. To whoever ends up raising her, I hope you're better than I was. I hope you give her what I couldn't. She's fire. Don't try to tame her. Let her burn and love her anyway. I read it 3 times, then once more, slower. That was the moment I realized this was never about saving Lila. She didn't need to be saved. She needed space. She needed someone to witness her, to see her, and not flinch when the heat kicked up. I walked to her room that night, the letter still in my hand. I asked if she wanted to read something from her mom, and she looked at me like I'd just offered her the moon. She didn't cry. She just held the letter and said, she knew me, and then she hugged me tightly, awkwardly, fiercely, like someone choosing to stay. And that's when I made the choice. The next morning, I took down the framed family photo from my hallway, the one of my parents and me, taken when I was 6, all of us stiff and uncomfortable in matching sweaters. I replaced it with a candid shot I'd taken of Lila at the park, her hair wild, her smile defiant, mid-laugh. She hadn't even known I was taking it. It wasn't polished. It wasn't posed. But it was real. My father came by later that week, standing in the doorway like he was still testing the water. He saw the photo. He said nothing, but I saw his eyes linger. And I didn't invite him in. Not yet. Because some inheritances need to be broken before they're passed on. And some families are built, not born. Even if they don't look the way anyone expected. Especially then.